Okay, it looks like we're live. So I'm just going to switch to this slide. Just want to start welcoming people coming in slowly. We're just getting things queued up, waiting for everybody to come in and figure out how to chat. So if you're at our Facebook page or at the live stream page, make sure to just click check in and chat. It's a big red button, and momentarily we'll get ready. Got Scott Morrison here, the CTO at Layer 7, and we're just excited to take all your questions. So we'll just give it a couple more minutes to make sure people are checking in, and we see a few people trickling in, and we'll get ready to go. Okay, well, I can see people are starting to check in now. So today's talk is going to be soap to rest adaptation, or simplifying soap to rest. And our guest speaker is Scott Morrison, CTO at Layer 7. And make sure you have lots of questions ready for him. Simple questions, complicated questions. He's here to answer. So I'll let Scott sort of introduce the topic and frame the conversation.
Well, let's keep the questions interesting, guys. So I'm Scott Morrison. I'm the CTO here at Layer 7. And listen, thanks a lot. It's great to actually be here, and especially now that I actually know where the camera is. Hopefully, I'll give some pretty good answers to what kind of stuff you're looking for. So let's talk about soap to rest and what it's really about. And to kind of frame this, I've actually got a couple of slides. So Stephen, can you actually find my first slide here? So I'm an old soap guy. You know, I got to tell you, I made a lot of my career in the early days, actually, you know, evangelizing what SOAP was about, working on standards, building infrastructure that actually did SOAP messaging and that. And so I've kind of been through the wars, and I've got more than a few scars over what's worked and what hasn't. And in the end, I guess, you know, if I had to summarize things, I kind of came out of it looking at the whole thing, saying, you know, we did some things right, but we did some things seriously wrong in a lot of ways. And as REST began to start to appear, and a lot of that began to really take off. You know, obviously with the publication of Roy Fielding's thesis, you know, literally back in the late 90s. But as momentum started to form around REST, it just made an awful lot of sense. And so when I look at our customer base now here at Layer 7, we do a tremendous amount of work with people working with REST. And it makes a lot of sense. If I sit down and do any kind of project on my own, if I'm just, you know, sort of hacking after the kids are in bed, you know, trying to do some kind of distributed computing system, I always gravitate towards doing things in REST. So I think it makes sense now. It aligns kind of with the sort of social zeitgeist of the whole, you know, computing industry. I like it a lot. And so what we're going to talk about today is how to make that easier. Because the truth is that SOAP's not going to go away, and there's a time and a place for everything. And I would never advocate just blindly going down one alley or the other. You've really got to kind of ask the application what it wants to do, what it's about. And I think you'll get the answer to, should this be a RESTful application, or should it really follow a SOAP RPC style? And to get at this more, let me introduce a couple of slides. And trust me, this isn't going to be a lecture. This is going to be a discussion. But I do want to frame the question a little more. And so the first slide really is kind of showing the classic SOAP RPC model, which is, you know, maybe a large farm of servers. And many of you may have exactly this in your DMZs right now, where you've got SOAP endpoints on some kind of application server. They probably interface with existing legacy technology in the back end there. And they probably talk to identity access management systems, whether it's an Active Directory server, or, you know, Utility Access Manager or Oracle Access Manager. Doesn't really matter which one. SOAP was really good at providing that interface where you're tying together different partners and that. And in particular, if you look at the lower left there, I'm kind of representing the client here as another big computer. Okay, it tends not to be a person; it tends to be another machine, and that. And so when you have a very formalized relationship, you know, with a partner, where you've got, let's say, trading contracts and things, where there's a certain amount of ceremony in creating that environment. So SOAP is actually pretty good. You know, you could do a lot worse. It actually gives you a lot of the capabilities that you really need. The problem, though, really gets into different scenarios like this one right here, which hopefully we can advance our slide. We may be, I think we've lost focus a bit, but The problem in SOAP, of course, becomes is as you move out to what I think of as more fast-moving agile devices. Okay, so not just agile programming, but agile devices where the whole world is moving pretty fast. You know, applications running on people's laptops are one of them, but of course we're seeing huge influx of mobility-based apps now. And let me tell you, there's no way you're going to be doing SOAP messaging out to an iPad or an Android or an iPhone or anything like that. Because the truth is that the infrastructure just doesn't exist on the client side to be able to work with that effectively. So if you buy into this idea then of doing distributed communications, you know, with all of these other remote devices out there, you want to make it very, very easy for people to actually be able to integrate services in that. Really, you're in a world of rest, and it makes tremendous sense. And as I said, this is the thing that even I gravitate towards in my own projects. So the big question of the day is this one, and let's advance the slide one more, is there an easy way of adapting? Because we don't want to just throw everything out and say redevelop everything. Because the truth is, a lot of people out there, a lot of you who are on this webinar, no doubt, are probably asking yourselves, what can I do to actually leverage RESTful concepts? What can I do to actually be able to make APIs that are perfectly appropriate for mobile devices, for integrating with other websites and things? You know, basically the modern approach to distributed computing. And how can I do that with what I've got, which is hundreds and hundreds of existing SOAP web services? And that's really what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about different strategies today for doing exactly that. So with that, why don't we turn it over to questions and actually see what kind of stuff comes out.
Sure. I just want to, I've noticed quite a few more people joining the conversation and who missed the kind of preamble. So make sure, you know, that you can ask questions. This is completely interactive. Check in, click the red button if you're in Facebook on the live stream. It says check in and chat, and then you can just log in and you'll have a little chat box and you can fire your questions in and Scott will answer them. So let's see, let's take one. First question we've got is, what if my web services have message-based security using WS security?
Okay. Now that's an interesting one. And you know, I kind of open this up saying I'm an old SOAP guy. The truth is, I worked a lot on the security aspects of how you secure SOAP messages. And the neat thing about the whole WS star world is there's good things and there's bad things about it. You know, it's been disparagingly called the WS Death Star, simply because it's big, it can destroy planets, it can, you know, it has a lot of people in it, and it's very complex and maybe empire-driven, if you will. But the truth is there were some good things in there too, and it would be a shame to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And one of the things that made a lot of sense in WS security, in particular, was the idea of message-based security. In other words, a security that had nothing to do with the transport, but could sort of flow through multiple hops and that. So in other words, you essentially encrypt and sign and secure components of the message itself. So the context of the security is actually, you know, quite literally gets preserved end to end, regardless of where that message goes, regardless of whether it gets printed out on a piece of paper or, you know, persisted onto a file somewhere. And truth be told, that's a hard thing to get away from, and that. So what we tend to advocate in cases like this, as you move towards, you know, the APIs, the RESTful style, and the whole API movement, is decouple yourself as much as you can from a lot of that. Because the truth is that as great an idea as message-based security was, I don't see, and this is the honest truth, I don't see a lot of great applications where people really needed it, where they couldn't just get away with good old-fashioned SSL. You know, SSL TLS took us a long time to get right as an industry. Where, you know, we got to SSL, you know, 3.0 or something like that, and then, you know, got refined further through TLS. And it got refined because we made mistakes, you know, as an industry. You know, we tried things, and eventually people found issues with it. But it's pretty stable right now. It's a great technology. It's used to secure some of the, you know, most mission-critical websites you can imagine. And moreover, it does the job in a very easy manner. You know, sometimes it's as easy, quite literally, as putting that S on the end of the HTTP, and all the rest just works for you. And you can't say the same thing for a lot of the classic WS star style models. So as much as possible, I would say, if you can embrace this idea of moving to transport security, definitely do it, because if you ask yourself the hard question, which is, did I really need message-based security? In a lot of cases, you probably didn't, and it's perfectly valid then to move to a more transport-based approach. Okay, so what else have we got here? What's coming in?
Another question coming in. Make sure you submit your questions through the chat, everybody. Here's another one. I've got hundreds of SOAP services and it's impractical to do a complete redesign. Can translation be automated?
Okay, listen, this is, whoa, this is a really good question, actually, and I totally understand this, because let's face it, you know, if you're coming to this problem and you've got a big legacy of existing SOAP applications, you don't want to just throw things away. I mean, the worst thing that could happen is that, you know, somebody just says, well, all this is wrong and not right, and you've got to move towards this completely new model of doing SOAP messaging. Doing API style messaging. And the truth is, you want to preserve legacy. I mean, anybody who tells you you should throw your old stuff away and do it completely new, you know, really doesn't have your best interests at heart. So the big question then really is, you know, what can the industry offer you to make this whole thing easier? You know, what can the industry give you that sort of automates the whole process and makes it easier? And the truth is, and depending on how much time you have, I'd love to you know, spend a bit of time talking about the philosophy of what happens as you move from SOAP to, you know, RESTful APIs. Because in a lot of ways, it's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to rethink your architectural style and how you can actually, you know, take a different, more flexible approach to, you know, manipulating computer resources. But I'll be the first to admit that that's not always practical. And sometimes you just need something that gets you out of the gate fast. If you do have hundreds of API or hundreds of SOAP services and you need APIs, you know, pretty quick, you need to use automation. And that's one of the things that we've done here at Layer 7, actually, is work on that whole problem of trying to make it as automated as possible. Now, most of you are probably starting to shake your heads and thinking, oh God, he's going down the code gen path. And trust me, I've seen a lot of code gen in my time, and I'm extremely suspicious of it all the time. But it has its place. And in fact, when you think about it, if you're moving from a SOAP RPC model into a RESTful API, if your endpoint isn't necessarily to make a perfect RESTful environment where you're going to drink the Kool-Aid of Rastafarianism and really do it absolutely pure and true to the goals of things like REST. If you're just trying to solve a problem, which most of us are, it is practical actually to do a pretty, you know, simple and deterministic mapping between SOAP and into REST. And so one of the things we did at Layer 7 was actually build some technology to do exactly that. And what it'll do is it'll reflect on a SOAP wisdom and actually auto-generate transformations that'll create a RESTful API for you. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. And you know, if I said that, I think you should be very, very suspicious. But the truth is, it probably works in 80% of the scenarios. And really, when you look at it, that's probably going to solve most of your problems. There will always be a point where you have to kind of get in there and tweak things. All code generations like that. You know, GUI auto-generation of code, of course, works like that. You always want to be able to get in there and tweak things and deal with those corner cases and that. And hopefully, if we've done our job right here at Layer 7, you've got exactly that. You can override what the code gen really gives you. But the point is that it's also very good at giving you a reasonable RESTful API. It may not be perfect in every scenario, but it actually allows you to start to get up and get out the door so that you can then focus all of your energies you know, that are left on those hard corner cases where a human decision is ultimately required.
We've got another question, and I see a few more people joining in, so just don't forget to send in your questions, chat, and Scott's on a roll, so he's going to keep answering his questions. We've got one from California now, from Jamie. Can we do the same sort of schema validation with REST services that we do with SOAP services?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. The answer is that yes, absolutely, and you should. Okay, best practice for security, I think, in all kinds of distributed transactions, is check what's coming in and check what's going out of your endpoints all the time. Do it really rigorously. A huge number of potential exploits are all based on you know, people sort of bending the rules in terms of what can go into an application. You think of it, SQL injection is probably the most obvious example. You know, but so is all the different, you know, code insertion models, whether it's CSRF or, you know, cross-site scripting attacks and everything like that. So validation is very, very important. We were fortunate in the SOAP world in that we had things like XML Schema, which allowed us to do, you know, pretty good validation. And I say pretty good in that the technology allowed it. The actual implementation was generally pretty crappy. And the reason was, you know, actually harkening back to my previous answer, which was code gen. Most people got their schemas out of a simple code gen that went from, let's say, Java objects into an actual SOAP endpoint. And a lot of that code gen ended up in using some pretty crappy schemas where everything basically degenerated into simple strings and that. And of course, that's virtually no schema validation at all, other than the structural integrity of the XML package. But here's the thing: is there still is an analog in the RESTful API world for validation using things like XML schemas, and that's actually really some of the emerging schema languages for different data representations like JSON. So it's funny. Over the years, we thought, oh God, the problem with JSON is that it's very free format. It's beautiful in that it has an automatic binding to JavaScript. Couldn't be easier to use. It's very simple. It doesn't have any of the complexity and cruft and crap that that sort of grew out of XML. But at the same time, everybody started to recognize that they needed to be able to validate those content models. And fortunately, there's a couple of different approaches that are beginning to emerge to do JSON schema validation. And in fact, at Layer 7, we support that. We've got a plugin module that actually allows you to take a rigorous schema and apply it to a JSON data structure going in and out of, let's say, a RESTful API. So you actually can do that. But again, my caution there would be, don't make your schemas too simple. You should actually go in, and a good schema should be, very thoughtful. It should be very rigorous in its application of typing. Because if you can start to put, strong typing into your validation of parameters, if you can go from everything is a string to, well, actually everything is a set of integers, and in fact there's only 3 possible answers in here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, 8, 7, 6, and 4, 5, 7, 8. If you can begin to put that level of restriction on your parameterization everywhere, you're in a very, very good security stance. And in fact, I would argue that in a lot of ways, you would be much stronger with that kind of security stance than you would be using, a classical, rigorous, WS security model. So by all means, you should be approaching things with things like JSON schema validation.
A couple more questions coming in from California again. Eurus asks, why should I invest in REST when there aren't many standards yet that are finalized?
Ooh. That's a good question, actually, these some hard-hitting questions from California, which I should
Hercules,
California. So, it's a bit of a leap of faith. It's a bit of a leap of faith. It's funny, I remember a friend of mine when I was first trying to decide if I was going to have kids or not. And I was talking to a friend of mine who had kids, and he said, that's what he said to me. He said, in the end, you can rationalize everything, you think it through. In the end, it's just a leap of faith, and you got to do it. And of course, my kids, I'm glad I did it. And I think REST is a little like that in a way. It is a bit of a leap of faith in going from a world that's highly structured and highly vendor driven to one where it's very agile, very fast moving, and there aren't a lot of rules. But the good news is the rules are catching up. I think, when I look at the API movement, what excites me about it is it wasn't driven by a bunch of vendors. It wasn't driven by a bunch of people sitting, in the Marriott conference room, hammering out, what was best for their organization. What it was people trying to solve a problem. And the problem wasn't necessarily to try to make a big standard that, advanced your particular cause. The problem in the end was just trying to do effective applications. Nobody goes in there saying, my application is about distributed communication. My application instead is about something like building a Facebook, building a Twitter, building, trying to solve problems in social networking, trying to, be able to bring people together more effectively. The necessary evil of this is actually the distributed communications. And so the beauty of these things is that they were there to solve a problem. They solved a problem for the people who were actually, building real applications. So in cases like that, the solutions may have been in some ways very constrained, but they solve the important problem. And what's happening now is the standards are coming in retrospectively with the existing reference implementations that are out there, and the standards are falling out of those references. And that's a good thing. That's actually how the internet was built. Like if you talk to real old timers, even older than me, who are the veterans of the the RFC wars and things like that in the early days, like in the 70s and 80s, of actually building IP networks and that. They all talk about how the first thing to come out was the reference implementation. The code was first, the standard and the RFC in that was second. That was a good thing. And I think what's happening now in the RESTful world, in the API world, is exactly the same thing. The reference implementation comes first. The actual code and the thing that matters comes first. And basically the standard follows that. It learns from that. It refines that. It narrows it. It expands it. And I think we're getting back to a new age where we're doing standards right. So don't be afraid of the fact that maybe there isn't the formalization there, because I think that's a good thing, and standardization will follow. And truth be told, that's not the thing that's holding people back right now. In our experience and working with a lot of people doing APIs and REST, the lack of standard support actually isn't necessarily the thing that's causing the problems.
Jamie from California's got a follow-up question. If we don't like our kids, should we still move to REST? No.
Yeah, it's
picking up on your metaphor.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And listen, let me tell you, as any parent will tell you, you have your good days and your bad days.
But we love our kids.
But you love them anyway, and you know you made the right decision.
But he asked, we've tried to use standardized identity mechanisms like SAML for our SOAP services. Can we still use these in newer interactive standards like OAuth?
Yeah, actually, very true. Because again, anybody that tells you the API movement should be about doing everything differently and throwing away what you've already invested in is again, they're lying to you. Those people are lying to you, full stop. Really, the evolution of computing is the evolution of building on what we had before. And in a lot of ways, we stand on the shoulders of giants. We should be leveraging what came on before. Just because there's new stuff in the air doesn't necessarily mean that we should throw away huge investments. And SAML is a great example of that. Like I've always, I guess characterized myself as a big advocate of SAML. I think SAML makes tremendous sense, solves a lot of very important problems. Where it suffers is also from the same kind of I think in some ways overwrought complexity that a lot of the WS Star world really suffered from. But there is a very good model of being able to take something like SAML and moving it into the new agile, fast-moving, RESTful world. And in fact, there are bindings that people are working on in, again, a standardized method, interestingly enough, which actually allow you to take SAML, encapsulate it, as let's say an OAuth token, and use that, and so sort of get the best of both worlds. I'm excited by things like OAuth. I mean, we did, actually, my colleague Francois Lascelles last week did one of these kind of tech talks, the first one we actually ever did on OAuth, and we got a tremendous number of people to it. It was really exciting. There's a lot of buzz about this stuff because it solves a very important problem. It gets back to my earlier point, is it solved a problem, that we as developers really needed to deal with. But more and more, we also need to deal with the problem of bridging. And so I think there's good work being done right now in integrating things like SAML so that you don't have to make black and white choice and turn your back on the past. I think you can begin to bridge now in a very standardized way. And here at Layer 7, we're actually giving you some of the tools to do that. About a year and a half ago, we announced an OAuth toolkit, which was the building blocks of being able to do OAuth. And I'll tell you why we did that. We did that because OAuth was still a huge moving target. And it was the kind of thing that you couldn't practically go out there and say, I have the drop-in solution for. Because that drop-in solution would only work in the microcosm of itself. It wouldn't integrate. And OAuth's all about integration and that. So we said, instead, let's learn from the Unix metaphor of giving people a bunch of sharp tools and letting them sort of script stuff together. And that's the real secret to integration. And that was the idea behind the OAuth toolkit. But here's what's interesting is now it's April 2012, and I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that things like OAuth are mature enough that you can actually practically come out with real product now that says, yes, I do OAuth, I drop in, and I work in 80% of the cases. And in those 20% where it doesn't work, well, then you fall back onto the toolkit approach of tweaking stuff a little bit and that. And I think that's one of the things that we did here at Layer 7 because we thought it was the right evolution there. And I think SAML fits very well into that because one of the things we've done with our newer approach to true drop-in OAuth federation is to pull SAML in there because we're big advocates of that. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but to bring it back, yes, absolutely. You should, in fact, leverage SAML in OAuth environments, in RESTful environments. Bring the full kind of glory of your existing identity and access management systems into this modern new world.
I'm just laughing because we've got a question from Francois. I'm on a plane. Can I still use REST?
Francois, I hope you're resting on the plane. I hope you're very comfortable. Maybe they moved you up into the front of the plane, and that's why you've got internet connectivity there.
And you've got a comment on your shirt too.
Yeah.
Chris says, "I just want to say that I love your shirt. Do you think that the popularity of RESTful services will mean the end of XML?" Jason, I'm sorry, one of the words is cut off.
Yeah.
Is JSON the way?
Is JSON the way of the future?
Yeah. Listen.
And we'll get back to your question, Jamie. I just skipped over it.
Is JSON the future? Yeah, it is. Honestly, there was a movement in the XML world a long time ago to try to simplify XML because a lot of people were terrified about what was happening with it. Because the original XML spec was a marvel of brevity. It was like 50 pages or something. And it was simple. You could sit down and say, this is what XML is. You just kind of, it's a structure for making stuff up. The problem was all this, the cruft that started to go in on top of that and the difficulty in binding that to other languages. And there was a movement to actually try to sort of strip all of the extra stuff away from XML and just try to make it as simple as possible. The whole simple XML movement, which at the time didn't really take hold. But the truth is a lot of what JSON is about now is sort of recognizing that we got to make things simpler. We got to make automatic binding into higher level languages like JavaScript and that. Transparent. It just has to happen. The thing that excites me about these technologies, that we're settling on now as an industry, is that they have an almost fanatical observance of removing friction. If there's any kind of friction that sort of keeps people from being able to innovate and move, the technology sort of gets thrown away. I think that's a beautiful thing. And because of that, I think we will see a lot more new projects, of course, will all be JSON. That's just going to be the way it goes. Is SOAP and XML and things like that going to go away? Absolutely not. It's like I opened up the talk earlier saying, ask the application what it wants to be, and it'll answer as to should I be a SOAP application, should I be an API-based application. And if you're really an honest architect and you actually really think about the problems you're trying to solve, the answer will fall out, and it won't fall out of the religion of one thing or the other. And that, but choose carefully based on the capabilities, because the capabilities are very different in both those models. So, and I think there will always be a place for the XML world, the SOAP world. But I think if I look at the sort of overwhelming trends that are going on right now in this golden age, and I believe this is another golden age of development and developers and everything like that. If I look at that, I think that the underpinnings of that, the things that are really going to make that happen, are things like JSON, are things like OAuth, are things like RESTful APIs, are things like all of the other tools that are starting to come together, whether it's Cassandra or MongoDB or Memcache or all of the family of that, whether it's things like Hadoop, whether it's things like Node.js, new server-side frameworks for JavaScript, whether it's the social coding aspects of things like Git and GitHub in particular. I think what we're seeing is a perfect storm of technologies coming together, and I got to tell you, it's exciting. I mean, there's buzz in the air. I felt like in 1998. I want to party like it's 1999. God, I'm dating myself. Hey, granddad. But the truth is, it's like that. You know, it feels like this golden age of stuff. And I think this golden age is being enabled by great new ideas and great new technologies. Apply them, you know, with a jaundiced eye. You know, think about what the application wants to be. But I think if you think about that seriously, you think them find more of your applications want to be JSON, more of them want to be OAuth, more of them want to be RESTful APIs.
We've got we're getting a big queue of questions. So
Okay.
Rod in Vancouver says we've seen a lot of interest in big data lately, especially in the media. Where do you see REST placed in the big data movement?
Well, in the end, big data's got to become small data, and the small data's got to be transferred back and forth with REST. As simple as that. I mean, you know, I talk to a lot of the big data guys, and they're doing fascinating stuff. Man, it makes, you know, I mean, part of me is very tempted to sort of dive into that just because I find it really, really fascinating. But a lot of what big data is doing right now, a lot of the analysis that, you know, things like Hadoop and stuff like that are doing, they're offline. I mean, they're taking huge amounts of data and going offline and doing a lot of processing and then coming out with some interesting answer. You know, there's less real-time big data processing than people think. Even with things like, you know, business intelligence and analytics, a lot of that is sort of, you know, offline processing. So I think the thing about APIs in that is that APIs are the glue that allows you, once you've done a lot of that processing, to be able to get the answers out and that. And so they're the, you know, they're the conduit for the little answers from the big data. They're not necessarily the conduit for moving big data around, because as much as possible, we don't want to move a lot of big data around. We want to centralize it, you know, move the data to the processing locations, like where your heart, you know, your horsepower is, and make the magic happen there. But in the end, the interesting answer has to get somewhere, and that's really the key to RESTful APIs and such.
So back to Jamie. He's been waiting for his answer patiently. Microsoft is working on their own further refined version of JSON, similar to layer O data on top of XML. How can we prepare for a takeover of these standards by the industry giants now that their attention is focused on these new API mechanisms?
Oh, wow, that's interesting, actually. You know, as a vendor and somebody who's spent a lot of time in the standards world, I have an interesting perspective on that. You know, and I'll tell you, you know, the WSR world was driven by vendor interest. Full stop. Okay, let's face it. We were out there, you know, advancing our own interests and things like that. We had a lot of good ideas, but in a lot of ways, they weren't necessarily lined up with what people really needed. I think, to go back to my earlier analogy of this being a golden age, this is a golden age driven by developers and people actually doing stuff, and people trying to solve real problems. I think all vendors, you know, and I'll throw myself in here as, you know, as a CTO of a you know, product company, Layer 7. You know, we obviously have our own interests in trying to, you know, sell product and everything like that. But the truth is, I don't think we can recapture what's happened. I think the horse has left the barn in terms of where the innovation is going now. Right? The innovation is out there in the field. It's out there in the streets, okay? And we can't go in there. We're kind of like the fashion designers who are watching the streets and trying to sort of impose our vision on it. But the truth is, all the interesting innovations coming out of the streets right now. And I don't, you know, I think we can help to mold. And I think at our best, what we as vendors should be doing is recognizing that innovation, helping to sort of mold it where it needs molding. And I think OAuth is a great example of where that has happened, where you know, vendors have come in afterwards and not tried to wreck the process. They're not tried to, you know, destroy the party, but instead, you know, deal with all the stuff that's quite frankly not a lot of fun, which is, you know, sitting in Oasis meetings or you know, W3C meetings or IETF meetings or whatever the case may be. You know, certainly Oasis in the case of OAuth, and just trying to sort of formalize the stuff around all the innovation that's happened, you know, and you know, refining, amplifying, you know, where necessary for purposes of interoperability. Because I think in the end, standards are about interoperability. We kind of forget that somehow. Standards aren't an engine for innovation. Standards are an engine for interop, and interop's good for everybody. So I think when I see stuff like companies like Microsoft coming in, you know, IBM, you know, others, I don't get scared of that, because I think they've sort of, to a certain extent, they've recognized, you know, that they're there in a sense to help to try to create at their best, you know, a little formalization around good processes. I'm interested in stuff like OData. I think it solves an important problem that has its place. It's not for everybody, you know, and I think it's one of those things, those technologies that you should look at, the same that you should look at Atom Pub and things like that, and look seriously as to, does that model fit within what you're doing? Because I think the truth is, in the wild west of the API world, you know, there's a lot of just get her done and it's good enough. I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think a good architect should also be aware of the values of OData, the values of Atom Pub, the values of some of these other things, and know when to apply them and when not to apply them. So I don't think the world's going to get hijacked by the vendors anymore. I think we as vendors have all learned our lesson, and I don't think, quite frankly, you, the developers out there in the real world innovating, have much to worry about there, because I don't think you'll let that happen.
Okay. Yours has been waiting patiently as well. His question is, everyone seems to be using different message formats with REST. HTTP form, XML, JSON, what should I be using? What happens if I adopt one and the standards move in a different direction?
Ooh, oh, good question.
How do you decide?
You know, to a certain extent, you look at the big picture of what you're trying to achieve. You know, definitely you can do worse than you know, sort of line up with the current sort of popular trend of HTTP with JSON as data structure, simply because it's simple. You know, it's widely supported. You get automatic bindings into JavaScript. You get, you know, trivial bindings into other languages like Java and Ruby and C# and things like that. So you could do a lot worse there. So you really have to ask yourself is, does that just solve your problem? If that solves your problem, you're done. Okay, you go with the flow because it was created because it made tremendous sense. If you need a certain amount of formalized structure on things, where you think that you know, something like XML makes sense, and XML still does make sense in a lot of cases. You know, if you're going to be transforming documents from one form to another, if you need, you know, a slightly more rigorous versioning model and things like that, there's tremendous value in XML, and by all means, focus again on XML. If you have a lot of XML on the back end already, you have to ask yourself seriously, maybe you should just be, you know, kind of pulling that out and exposing that to the outside world. You know, the reason, when you think about the reason JSON appeared, it's not because you couldn't do XML in the context of a browser. Like, it's not like JavaScript had no XML support. It just had a difficult, awkward XML support, and JSON was a lot easier. So if you're trying to appeal to, you know, browser-based clients and things like that, you know, think about that. Think about the ramifications of trying to push XML all the way out to a browser. Think about the ramifications of trying to send it all out to an iPhone or something like that, where, yeah, there's a SAX parser, but the tooling to deal with, you know, big XML and complex XML documents just isn't very good. So think a lot about your target audience, you know, where you want to take your API strategy, and weigh that against what you've got, and the answer should fall out of that in the end.
Kind of a follow-up question from yours too is, existing partner integrations is done and working just fine via SOAP. Is there any reason to move to REST?
Listen, don't, you know, if you've got something that works, don't change it. You know, if it ain't broke, don't change it. But if it's in a situation where you've got something that works fine, but you need to create, I guess, new integrations to new kinds of devices, then you don't have to replace things. There's no reason at all you can't have these two things coexisting. So, good example would be, I've got a customer that's a big publisher. You know, they do a lot of you know, everything from textbook publishing to popular press and everything like that. They had a lot of, you know, classic integrations using, you know, classical web services, so the WS Star stack out the yin-yang. But they started to realize that they also wanted to make their applications and that available to other, you know, developers working on iPhones, and they wanted to be able to do faster, you know, more agile integrations out to you know, browser-based apps, or even new partners who are, you know, just sort of saying, you know, we don't deal with this SOAP stuff at all, and that. So what they did is they actually created parallel services, you know, which again, we're using Layer 7's technology to kind of shunt things in to the application. So there were kind of two paths into the application. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that kind of model. I think, in fact, I'm a big advocate of that. Don't throw away what's there. Don't try to break everything that's there. But use this, kind of new world as an opportunity to reach out and amplify your coverage in that. Because it isn't an either-or thing in a lot of cases. It's a coexistence thing. And the technology does exist to be able to, either auto map using some of the technology that we have at layer 7 to, give yourself APIs out of, services, or else also use it as this customer did to sort of look at their whole model in the back and think a little more about maybe how they could adapt a little more. So how they could move from a classic RPC mechanism to the RESTful style, a more pure RESTful style where they're thinking about resources and representations, and that's a very different thing. That's a very, I wish we had more time to talk about that, because it's a fascinating sort of exploration in how you manipulate, like how you represent objects and application interfaces, and I think there's tremendous value in sort of looking at that problem. But again, you don't have to, choose one or the other.
So I think we probably have time for one or two more questions.
Okay. Right.
So if anybody else, if you've got other questions, fire them in, and we'll get this one going. SOAP is great for complex payloads. How can you move these into HTTP parameters?
Okay. Actually, you know what? There's a bit of misconception in some ways. Like when you look at SOAP, you look at this model that's all based on posting XML back and forth, and so it's very much about big, structured, highly encapsulated data. And in a lot of ways, people think of REST as, okay, well, REST is different because you're using the URI as a kind of a mechanism of identifying a resource, and you're doing the basic, almost CRUD-like mechanisms on that with put, post, delete, and get, and you're thinking a lot more about your parameterization is how you carry your parameters is often different. In some cases, it migrates up to query parameters and that. And trust me, the RESTful guys have a lot to say about when something should be a query parameter or when it shouldn't. But the truth is that you very much can serialize fairly complex objects, take a serialized representation, whether it's XML or JSON, and move that and easily translate that into simple HTTP parameterization. That's often not good REST. In fact, it's often terrible REST. It's often what they call, just tunneling through HTTP parameters. But in some ways, it's an expedient method of getting out, and maybe an interesting, sort of stepping stone on the way to a more, kind of pure REST model. And I, as much as possible as an architect, I try to avoid the arguments of pure, theoretical REST versus, the practical aspects of just what you got to do to get things done. But the truth is, don't feel that you have to overly simplify your parameterizations and that, just because you're working in the HTTP world. You can actually get away with an awful lot. The HTTP spec doesn't constrain you very much in, how large parameters can be and how large URIs can be. Browsers do to a certain extent, but not HTTP, not HTTP.
Yeah, so I think that's all the questions we have.
Okay. And actually, by the way, just flash this up real quickly. I guess, last night I was thinking about the stuff, and I did a quick, kind of literature search because, I wanted to kind of see what other people were saying about it. And I came across a great article, by the way, from a few years ago, actually, by Aaron Scannard, who did it. He did it in the Microsoft Developer Network. Go take a look at this thing. This, if you really want to think about, the different, the philosophical differences between RPC models versus a more pure REST model of resources and representations, and what it takes to move from, that world, from a world of kind of verbs and nouns into a world of nouns, resources that are, governed by the verbs of HTTP. This is actually a surprisingly good article. I shouldn't say surprisingly good, it's an excellent article. The whole middle section is all very .NET centric, and I happen to be a Java guy, so I just skipped over most of that. But the rest of the article is you could just talks about the whole general issue and that in a very coherent way. So I'd highly recommend people don't take a look at this. I thought it was extremely well done and that, and you'll learn a lot from it. It's very succinct. So, with that, listen, thanks a lot, everybody. I really appreciate you getting on. This has been a lot of fun. So the first time I've done this, and Stephen, thanks for setting it all up.
Yeah, no problem.
I hope we can do all of this again, and I'll talk to you again soon. If you see me at a conference or whatever, by all means, come on up and let's chat some more about this.
We've got another one coming up in 2 weeks, so April 17th, save the date, and it's going to be caching and API optimization. And I'm sure that's something that you know a lot about.
Wow, listen, I'm going to watch that one.
But thanks again, everybody, for sending in your questions, and thanks, Scott. Great talk. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.